Before I jump into the presentation, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. And, um, for me, the meaning and significance of this acknowledgement is continually evolving over time. And I can speak personally, for me, my understanding has really been sharpened by conversations I've had with many of my peers, and in particular my children who are learning about our shared history in school, uh, learning things that I myself, growing up in Alberta, was never introduced to at their age. And my daughter recently reminded me that reconciliation is really about facing our history with courage, always in the search of truth. And it falls to all of us as well to be willing to speak that truth to power when necessary. And so it's in that spirit that I'd like to read this land acknowledgement today and begin our session. And so I want to acknowledge that we are located on Treaty 6 territory and respect the histories, languages, and cultures of the First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. And so today, what I'd like to do is cover three things. I definitely want to introduce you to this process we're calling the pivot and talk a little bit about how you can participate the pivot. But before doing so, I just want to provide a little bit of background and a little bit of context to the Affordable Housing Solutions Lab, why it exists, and why we developed this process we're calling the pivot. And then finally, I want to give you a chance to ask any questions you might have. So starting with the Affordable Housing Solutions Lab, who are we? As I mentioned, I'm a professor at the University of Alberta. I'm also the research lead for the lab. And I see this lab as a space or a platform. And over the past few years, we've really been a virtual space, but a space or platform that exists as a catalyst for expanding the supply, diversity, and accessibility of safe, affordable, and adequate housing choices in Edmonton. It's an initiative that was developed through a partnership between the University of Alberta and the City of Edmonton. And it's supported by some generous funds from the City of Edmonton. We've also collaborated with MacEwan University, as well as some faculty and staff there, as well as a number of other stakeholders in Edmonton over the past 2 years. The lab itself is tasked with many different things, from researching best practices related to affordable housing development to researching housing affordability and its implications for people in much of this work involves pulling together data on affordable housing. So data that can be used to create information that can then be applied to decision-making. Also, this encompasses supporting the development of new and innovative concepts related to affordable housing. And finally, importantly, it's also encompassed developing community-based research that really exists to empower citizens to identify some challenges and needs in the community. And this work also involves raising awareness of the need for and right to adequate housing. It's these two bullet points at the bottom here that I think connect most directly to what we're calling the pivot, and we'll talk about a little bit more later. So the lab itself really functions, as I mentioned, to empower citizens to innovate and create and develop solutions. But in our work over the past 2 years, as we've engaged with community, engaged with stakeholders in the housing sector, what we've come to appreciate is the value of community-based approaches, the value of equity-centered design. So approaches that are fair and inclusive and provide opportunities for all stakeholders of all different types to participate in some of the work that we're doing. And these two things, community-based approaches and equity-centered designs, these are two values that we've really elevated in the practices that we've been using in the lab, reflected in what we're calling the pivot, and what I'll talk about a little later. Why have a lab like this? Why do this and do this kind of work? Well, to be frank, I would say our housing system is failing. And, all of us in Alberta have been, talking about, in the context of COVID-19, our hospital system under potential collapse. And this has been a real, you know, epistemic threat to us all. Well, this has made me think about our housing system and recognize the fact that it has been failing for many decades now. And the starkest sign of this is homelessness. And it's a very visible sign of some of the failures in our housing system. In Edmonton, for example, around 2,600 people are experiencing homelessness right now. And well over 50% of these individuals identify as Indigenous. An important aspect of the inadequacy and failures in our housing system is affordability. And some of the hardship faced by Edmontonians today is linked to the cost of housing. And so this is some data from CMHC for 2020, which estimated that only about 15% of the rental stock in the private market is affordable for households who are earning less than $36,000 a year. And here, when we're talking about affordability, we're using a particular measure, which is that households shouldn't be spending more than 30% of their income on shelter. That's a general rule of thumb that has been used. And it recognizes that households that are spending more than that are likely making some trade-offs or having to spend less on other basic goods. Another way of appreciating or of comprehending the affordability challenges is to think about something like the range. And this is a concept that many people are using now. And it asks, how much does someone, like for example, someone earning minimum wage, how many hours do they have to work to earn enough to afford the available housing in the community at an affordable rate? And so we can generate some ballpark figures here. So someone earning minimum wage to afford to pay less than 30% of their income on a bachelor seat would have to work 197 hours a month. Similarly, someone earning that wage would have to work 228 hours a month to afford a one-bedroom apartment. So here we can begin to see, even for those earning minimum wage, working very hard full-time, still can struggle to find affordable housing in the community. Many of these households are making trade-offs, spending less on essentials like food, transportation, and clothing. Statistics Canada provides us with an estimate of the cost of a basic basket of goods, excluding shelter costs, but a basic basket of goods, food, clothing, transportation, and other basic necessities. And in 2018, that was estimated in Edmonton to be about $2,401. So using figures like this and using estimates of the average cost of housing, we can estimate, or we can get a sense of some of the hardship that some households are facing. So for instance, a household of 2 adults and 2 children who are earning less than $45,588 per year are having to make some of these trade-offs. They're having to cut spending on food, transportation, and clothing to remain housed. So these statistics just give us a sense of the need in the community when it comes to affordability. Another reason, another important context for why we have this lab and why we're planning this initiative called the Pivot is the changing legal context and its bearing on housing. So what I'm speaking about here primarily is the National Housing Strategy Act, which in Canada became law in 2019. And this legislation recognizes the right to adequate housing as a fundamental human right. And this is a really important moment in Canada. This is just the actual text from Bill C-97, which received royal assent in 2019. And so this is now housing policy in Canada. It's housing policy to recognize the right to adequate housing, recognize it as a fundamental human right, and commits our government to the progressive realization of the right to adequate housing. And so this legal context itself is really important because it is encouraging new forms of collaboration, a new type of consensus that has reaching across cities, across Canada, and really is shifting how we're thinking about our housing system and some of the challenges that we face. The shift is just one example of this, and the right to home municipal call to action, it really is reflective of this growing pan-Canadian consensus with respect to housing and the right to adequate housing. This was a call to action that was recently developed, and Edmonton signed on and supported this call to action. And in this call to action, I encourage you to look it up, and we can share these links afterwards as well if it's hard to look at them now. But this call to action, has some really important commitments and language within it. It states things like cities agree that in order to effectively address this crisis, all orders of government must develop enhanced coordination, and housing must be treated as a human right rather than a matter of inconsistent social policy, charity, or financial instrument. So we're living in a moment when the way we see and understand housing is perhaps shifting and perhaps opening up different and new opportunities and spaces to make change in the community. So this is the context in which we developed in which we were working and in which we developed this initiative that we're calling the Pivot. And so it's this initiative that I want to provide you some information about. And when we first began planning this initiative, the question we were really considering was this. We were asking, what actions can we take in the next 6 months to help pivot, to help turn Edmonton's housing system in a more just, sustainable, and equitable direction? And there's two lenses, two ways of looking at the problem that we want to apply in this approach. One really important lens is the rights-based approach, the right to adequate housing, the legal and legislative context that I was describing earlier. Another lens that we want to apply and is reflective of some of those principles that I mentioned earlier is a community-based approach. And so together, bringing these together is perhaps an innovative or a new way of seeing some of these challenges and perhaps some of the actions that we can take in answering this question. Now, when it comes to the rights-based approach, and when it comes to the right to adequate housing, a really important foundation to build upon is a clear understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about adequate housing. So adequate housing is certainly much more than just 4 walls and a roof. And I would say it's also much more than just affordability. So where we've been working around a concept of affordability in our lab, with this lens of the right to adequate housing, it really compels us to recognize that housing is about much more. It's about location. It's about the physical accessibility of housing. It's about the kind of security someone has, the legal protection they have against eviction. It's about the condition of that housing, the habitability, and it's about the availability of services that people can access at that location. It's also about the cultural adequacy, which is really important given our context here in Edmonton. So when we're talking about the right to adequate housing and when we want to understand what adequate housing is, these are the kinds of components that we can point to in measuring or when evaluating the adequacy of housing. Importantly, too, a rights-based framework begins with this important claim, which is that the right to housing is a fundamental human right linked to dignity and the right to life, and that it requires immediate action. So this is something that we can't just wait upon. This is something that's not waiting for us in the future to address. This is something that requires urgent action now. It also treats those who are in need as rights holders. And this is perhaps something that's new in how we're talking about housing or how we've talked about housing in the past. It also requires us to meaningfully involve those who are living in need in the development of housing policy itself. That's a really important dimension of the rights-based framework. And so that participatory nature of rights-based framework is something that we've definitely been paying close attention to in our work. There's been a number of approaches, a number of guidelines have been developed when it comes to the implementation of the right to adequate housing. One document which provides some excellent guidelines is this one here. It's the guides. It's titled "The Guidelines for the Implementation of the Right to Adequate Housing." It was developed by the Rapporteur on Housing at the United Nations. It consists of 14 guidelines. I've just pulled 3 out here, but all of them are relevant to the work we want to do. But these 3 in particular kind of resonate with some of the steps we're taking. So first, one guideline is take immediate steps to ensure that the right to adequate housing is realized. Number 3 here, ensure meaningful participation in the design, implementation, and monitoring of housing policies and decisions. So participation of folks who are actually living these experiences. And number 4 here, implement comprehensive strategies for the realization of the right to housing. So we're not talking about a silver bullet solution. We're talking about comprehensive strategies. There is no one solution that's going to address this problem. There is a whole set of approaches and actions that we need to consider. And these need to involve people in these processes, and we need to take immediate steps. This is what I've really pulled out of these guidelines in particular. There's many others, really important ones in this document. The second part of that lens that I introduced, moving from that rights-based approach, is the community-based approach. And in this regard, what we're doing with this initiative that we're calling the Pivot is grounding it in a particular approach, what researchers would call perhaps a paradigm, a way of working. And the term that we're using to describe this is community-based participatory action research. And it's a mouthful, but I kind of break it down into 3 components. First, it's community-based. So it's really grounded in the needs, the concerns, and the strategies of community members. Second, it is participatory. So it directly involves community members and organizations in the research process. And finally, it's action orientated. So it supports strategic action that leads to change in the community, and it supports actions that the community itself views as important and meaningful. So thinking about these things together, what we're talking about when we talk about community-based participatory action research is we're really talking about a collaborative approach to research that involves all stakeholders throughout the research process, from establishing the research questions to developing the data collection methods to doing the analysis to actually sharing the findings. So involving community members in each of those steps is really what defines or sets this particular approach apart from others. And for me as a researcher, this is actually a very different way of working. It involves me stepping out of the driver's seat into the passenger seat and allowing community members or perhaps other stakeholders to really drive the research forward. So taking these 2 lenses into consideration, the rights-based lens and the community-based participatory action research lens, what we've done is actually sharpen that question that I introduced to you earlier. Sharpened it ever so slightly. And what we're asking in this process is, what actions can we take in the next 6 months to help pivot, to help turn Edmonton's housing system towards the progressive realization of the right to adequate housing? And in this work, what we really want to do is we really want to center the experience of what we're referring to as first voice advocates, individuals with lived experience. So these are community members with firsthand experience of housing inadequacy, housing insecurity, housing discrimination, homelessness. And we really want to do our best to center this process on those experiences and to stay true to some of the principles of community-based research. Now, what I'd like to do now is just provide a little bit more detail on the actual pivot initiative. And we see it very much as a process. And this process is laid out here in this nice continuum. And in the first phase of this process, which we planned, it consists of these first 3 steps here, a 3-part series, you could think of it as. It begins with an orientation, which is followed by a virtual gathering, and then what we're calling a 5-week hike. And all 3 of these components, all 3 of these parts are online and virtual. And I'll go into a little bit more detail regarding what each encompasses here in a moment. But this is just what you could think of as the first phase. And hopefully moving forward after completing this first phase with some of you, if you choose to participate with us, is these remaining phases which we'll aim to accomplish over the next 6 months. So what do each of these encompass? So part 1 is very much, as I described, an orientation. And I kind of see this as a process of self-reflection. And so with participants, with perhaps folks like you, what we aim to do is ask this question: what do we need to put in place to have courageous conversations about the right to adequate housing? So during this virtual session, we'll really be building a foundation for us to work together in a real genuine and authentic way, because participants are going to be coming from all walks of life. And so building a space within which we can have these difficult conversations is really important. Part 2, I envision it as an exploration process. And in this process with participants, what we'll be doing is exploring the current situation with regard to the right to adequate housing here in Edmonton. And so we'll be exploring the situation, again, centering our exploration on the experiences of people here in Edmonton, people who've experienced housing insecurity, discrimination, for example, and hopefully as a group developing an understanding of housing inequity and perhaps what we need to do here in Edmonton in the short term. This leads us into part 3, which is a 5-week hike. And this part is a little different than parts 1 and 2, which were 2 3-hour meetings. Part 3 is spread out over 5 weeks. And it consists of a survey and questions that are emailed to participants each week. And we receive that feedback from you, and you can answer those questions when you have time. We estimate that probably to take around 15 to 20 minutes of your time each week. But we will receive that feedback and then provide it back to you at the end of the week. And then that summary will lead into the next week's questions. So working in this way together over these 5 weeks, we hope to engage in this, what I'm thinking of as deliberation. We're really, as a group, thinking carefully about what actions are needed to implement the right to adequate housing here in Edmonton. And so this is set to start November 15th, and will continue for 5 weeks there. And so what can you expect as a participant in the pivot? Well, I think there's 2 things you can expect. And I'll go into a little bit of detail about the actual, some of the activities here. So what you can expect across these 3 parts is some participatory activities guided by facilitators that aim to do the following. So aim to co-create some shared principles that we can use to guide our process, and to establish what we're calling a brave space for discussion. This is really what we'll be doing in that part 1. You can expect some activities facilitated by us and some facilitators through which we'll explore the state of housing inequity, beginning with the experiences of First Voice advocates. We'll explore these experiences and this inequity using a triangle tool. And this will be an exercise that we'll use to really, I guess, sharpen our analysis and really focus on the important aspects that need attention. And so that's what you can expect in terms of your participation in these online activities, which will all be delivered over Zoom, the platform we're in today. The second thing you can expect, I think, and to be honest, is you can expect some difficult discussions, because I think what we're really going to be touching on unavoidably are some of our social positions, some of the power associated with those social positions, and some of the relationships of that power to housing inequity. So hopefully this gives you a sense of why we need to develop those principles, those guidelines for us to have some of these conversations, and why approaching this with courage is actually necessary. As far as the outcomes of the process are concerned, as I mentioned earlier, we've really planned the first phase of this pivot process, which is the first three components, the first three parts you see here. Following that 5-week hike, what we aim to do is develop a final report, which really will consist of a prioritized list of actions that we can take over the next 6 months. Now, some of these actions might demand some information, and developing that information could form the basis of an actual project. Some of these actions might involve piloting a new approach, and maybe that would be the basis for a new project. And so we're hoping that out of this final report and the actions it contains, we'll have the information we need to build some teams around some of these actions and around some of the research that's required. And hopefully some of you may want to join us on those teams and help us undertake that action research going forward. And so, as you can see from this continuum, what I'm talking about here are some of these steps that await us in the future. So developing some of those research questions related to these actions, building the teams, and doing the actual research, and then sharing that knowledge back to the community. So I've been talking for about a little over half an hour now, and I'm sure that many of you have questions. And what myself and Laura and our other team members would like to do is give our best shot at answering some of those questions. Also, we're very interested in your feedback, and particularly in ways we can improve upon this process. So what we've developed thus far, I see it as sort of the backbone of our process. And certainly I think there's going to be some additional features, additional activities we should add to this process to make it more inclusive, more accessible for people in the community. And so your feedback in that regard, I think, is really important. Now, as I mentioned at the outset, there's a couple different ways you can ask questions. You can put those questions in the chat box, and Laura is reading that chat box and she can read out those questions. You can also, if you'd like, raise a hand and then enable your mic and ask that question. We are recording this though, so if you'd like your question to be anonymous, I'd suggest just directing that question straight to Laura and she can read it out. But we do have some time. We've got about 25 minutes remaining in the info session today to answer any questions, receive any feedback you have, and then we'll aim to at about 12:30 today. So if people are raising their hand, I'm not sure if, hopefully I'll be able to see it. Ask Laura if there are any questions in the chat box.
We've got one. How will we be recruiting and compensating people with lived experience to participate in the pivot?
That's a great question. So we're recruiting participants through reaching out through some of our networks that we've developed already in the lab. So that process has begun and will be continuing. We've asked people who we've reached out to by email and through other means to pass along these invites to others that they think would be interested in this and would love to participate in. And so I'd encourage you as well, if you've received this invite and you know others who would perhaps be interested in it, please pass along that invite to them. As far as compensation is concerned, we have honorariums for our community, our participants from the community. And those are honorariums for each part, so parts 1, 2, and 3. And this just in recognition of the fact that some of our participants who are, perhaps professionals in the housing sector or in government would likely be participating in this process as part of their job, whereas people in the community would not be. And so in fairness and as a matter of equity, we've developed some honorariums and set aside some budget to provide that recognition to community participants. I should have mentioned as well, if there's a question you have that you don't want to post to the group, you're always welcome to contact me directly. And I realize now I didn't put my contact information on the slide here, but I can provide, I'll pop my email in the chat box here at the end that, and you can contact me directly with any questions you have.
Got a couple more questions.
Sure.
And a resource that somebody posted, which is a great resource from Radical Inclusion, talking about implementation for changes for housing and homelessness around disability. Yes. So that link is in the chat. Thank you.
Yes, and Laura, can I just say something about that too? I perhaps didn't mention this. One of the things we want to do with this process is build on the work that's already been done. And Radical Inclusion put out a fantastic call to action very recently. And so I see this process as just another vehicle to move some of that work forward. And so I don't think this process should be thought of as set apart from that, but it's a process to take up some of those calls to action and work and connect with others who can move them forward. So that's a really important resource that someone brought forward there. Thank you.
Just a reminder, if you do want to raise your hand on the Zoom toolbar at the very bottom, there's a little smiley face with a plus that says reactions. You can click on that and you can raise your hand. We have 2 more questions that I see so far. One question is asking about Indigenous organizations, wondering which are a part of this pivot.
We have had, Laura, I think we've had quite a few participants register for our this session and even for the first session. And I haven't looked closely at that registration list to answer that question precisely. So I'm not sure, but Indigenous organizations would be a really important stakeholder to involve in this process. We've reached out to some, and it's the onus is on us over the next few weeks to really confirm some of that participation and also reach out to others that perhaps we haven't connected with yet. So yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't looked at the registration list closely yet, but that's something in the coming week we will be doing.
Yeah, and just to add to that, the question I think is kind of 2-pronged. So this initiative is something the lab is kind of created as a draft, which is why we're seeking feedback. And if, we're also seeking out more active participation to adjust things as needed. We do have some groups that have joined us for the orientation, but we're still in the process of recruiting, so I don't want to single anyone out. One of our fellow members, we have some fellows with the lab, is also part of End Poverty Edmonton's Indigenous Circle. So yeah, we definitely have more to do, but that's kind of where things are at, just to give an update. We had another question There's still needing some clarity to the objective of the program. When one starts a research project, there's usually a question to be answered. What is the big question being addressed?
Yeah, so this process is really designed to identify the actions that we as a city, as a community need to take urgently. And then once we've arrived at those actions, that's the foundation upon which we can develop some of the research questions I think you're alluding to. So these steps that we planned are actually before we would get to those steps to develop some of the research questions. And out of this process, I see like a number of research questions that could possibly come out of this work. We have some resources to support at least 3 projects. So support projects that could address 3 different research questions. And presumably those research questions would be linked to some of the actions that have been identified. And so it's a little early for me to say what those specific research questions are, because really what I want to do is really empower the community to develop those over the course of this process. And so the question we're really working with at present is that question, that broader question, which is, what actions can we take to pivot the housing system here in Edmonton towards the realization of the right to adequate housing. That's a more general, broad question that's giving us some direction. The more specific research questions that pertain to some of those actions and to some of the experiences being lived here in Edmonton, those remain to be determined through this process. So hopefully that's clear. And in that regard, hopefully the connection to the community-based approach is clear as well.
Thanks, Josh. And I think to add to what you've just said, to the question asked, the whole goal with this is to pivot the way that we look at housing, because the first step in how we understand these things is missing, especially from the perspective of folks who are living this, which is why we're really committed to grounding this in a rights-based approach. And that came out really clearly in our recent series on access to housing choice. So we're just trying to build on that and trying to fill in some of the key informational gaps, but not just being purely data-driven or information-driven. The goal is to design projects or activities that are also action-based, so it's not one or the other. But yeah, if you have any additional questions or feedback, please let us know. I've got a couple more questions here.
Oh, that's great.
With this being a multi-sectoral intersectional social innovation lab type of approach, how will you ensure a diverse and effective research team is pulled together for each project when determined? Can we get an idea of what resources will be available for each research project?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's something that, we'll have to carefully plan for January, when I envision these projects really developed and at the point where they can begin. And so, yeah, I think part of the answer to your question, I think we're going to explore through this process that we've outlined here. I think some of the shared principles we will develop in part 1 of this process is certainly going to inform how we think about equity in the composition of these smaller research teams. I think those research teams themselves are going to require some capacity and resources to ensure that they can operate. And so in that regard, we have to ensure that they're adequately resourced. But I hopefully through the process, these first 3 steps that we've designed and some of the heavy lifting we're doing at the beginning, we'll have those principles and those shared understandings to develop the kinds of teams that I think you're referring to, teams that are equitable in composition, well-resourced to ensure that community participants can meaningfully participate and can successfully, accomplish their work. I think one unique characteristic of this approach is it is straddling the university and the community. And so we have many students and a few professors who are very interested in this topic, in the right to housing, in community housing, and in housing issues more generally. And really what we want to do is link and match these students and some of their academic endeavors with the community using this community-based paradigm. And so that's also the overarching goal. But I think embedded in your question is a really good suggestion in terms of like what we need to think carefully about moving forward and looking forward to the horizon when these projects will begin.
Thanks for that question. Got another question. Will the survey part 3 of the process be sent only to lab participants, or will there be a broader distribution? If so, what are the strategies for reaching as many people as possible?
Yeah, very interesting question. Honestly, I think we only plan to be sending that survey to participants, and maybe survey might be giving people a slightly wrong impression of what it is. We're calling it a survey, but it really is a document containing questions that people are assigned to work on that week. But will this process involve surveying the broader community on issues? That's a really good, I didn't think about that. And, it's perhaps something we can also consider as another way to be gathering input on some of the topics and themes that we'll be exploring in that part 3.
We've got another question about, is there a similar program in Calgary or corollary program in Calgary? If not, will all our work be made available?
I'm not sure if there's a similar program to the Pivot in Calgary. I think there are similar social and innovation labs in Calgary, and who would bring a kind of similar approach to exploring housing affordability and the right to adequate housing. But we haven't planned anything in Calgary. Our work is very much focused locally on Edmonton, but we are committed to disseminating the outputs from this work. So starting with the final report that I mentioned, and then the research outputs from some of those action research projects as well would be also shared publicly. And so in that regard, the work that's coming out of this lab would certainly be available to others in other cities and hopefully would be of use to them.
Yeah, and I popped the link into the chat just to add to what you've said. There is a project out of Calgary, a housing lab, but their focus is quite different to ours. It's focused on environmental performance and incorporating that into affordable housing projects. Our approach is different because we really are aiming to center the voices of rights holders, folks with lived experience, first voice advocates, and then to build the capacity around that. So we're not just throwing people into the center and expecting folks to run things themselves. We will be providing support, but that's a bit of a different approach. And of course, we do need more participants and more collaboration with all that are involved in the housing sector. That's important. Those partnerships are important. That expertise is important. But our approach is a bit different in that way. There was a question, are there already formal partnerships with any of the sector organizing and support players such as Homeward Trust or others to guide, coach, inform the work? Kind of asking if there's a steering committee and who might be on that steering committee.
Great question. Yeah, I mean, at present, we don't have a formal connection to Homeward Trust Edmonton. But with respect to the lab, we have a management board, a small management board, which is not a community advisory board. It functions in a slightly different way and is more reflective of the role of the City of Edmonton and the University of Alberta in this lab. What we have built at the lab is a fellows program, and that fellows program would look more like a community advisory board, but we've approached it in a little bit more of an innovative way. And our fellows program and the fellows do more than just perhaps provide direction and advice. They actually take a more direct role in organizing some of our activities in the lab and identifying some of the priorities for activities that we help convene and coordinate, such as this one, the pivot. For the pivot itself, though, I mean, I think involving some of those important organizations, Homeward Trust Edmonton, some of the other nonprofit housing providers in Edmonton would be really important because of the role they play with respect to adequate housing here in Edmonton. So that's, I mean, reaching out to individuals and those organizations is one of the things that we have been doing over the past few weeks and will continue to do in moving forward.
Thanks, Josh. And to add to that question, our fellows definitely have been helpful. We also solicited feedback from the Edmonton Coalition on Housing and Homelessness. So we haven't gone, we kind of went to organizations, groups, advocates in that way, just to kind of get some feedback as we were planning this. But I think we were hesitant to implement a steering committee in the way that it's traditionally potentially worked in other spaces, where you have a lot of voices in the room. Everyone has kind of their own reasons for being there. We kind of wanted to start fresh. And that was the goal with the orientation, the virtual gathering, is to it takes work to apply a right to housing approach, and no one has quick and easy answers. It takes work and it requires a willingness to look at things a little bit differently. So I think we were kind of hoping at the end of the third event that we would have a good group of folks that could kind of act as a steering committee. We haven't formalized that, but we were hoping that people would continue on and help just kind of advise and steer this in the right direction. So yeah, it's a bit abstract doing community-based research, but the goal was to approach this from a different perspective. But of course, needing that support and needing that participation as well. And we do have many organizations that have registered for orientation. We hope will continue on with us. There's another question. Do you happen to know how much low-income housing is available? And I'm thinking maybe units in Edmonton, and how many are vacant?
Well, I would estimate there's very little vacancy in non-market housing, and I would base that on just the fact that wait lists for non-market housing are enormous, and some individuals and households wait years to access non-market housing that is intended for low-income households. So the need for low-income non-market housing is huge. Many of the folks who qualify for it but are on wait lists are in rental housing in the private market, and that housing can be far more expensive than they can afford. In the lab, we have been working with the City of Edmonton to develop an inventory of non-market housing, so that we can have we have a baseline count of how much is available in the community, and of what type and of what kind. And so that work is something that we've been developing and doing with in the lab in partnership with the City of Edmonton, and it's nearing completion. So it's very soon we'll have a baseline understanding of the supply of non-market low-income housing, much of which is operated by nonprofits here in Edmonton, and using that number, we can then have a better idea of how much more we need to develop in the community. And the timing is really good for that type of analysis, because the latest census, Statistics Canada census numbers should be coming soon. And so we'll have some more accurate numbers when it comes to the level of need that exists in Edmonton. And so with those two pieces of information, I think we'll be at a place where we can do a better assessment of the need that exists in the community, the supply of non-market housing, and the amount and type and location of housing that we need to add to the community. And that's just one approach to addressing the issue. There's other approaches to addressing housing affordability as well that are important to consider.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And to add to Josh's point, I think it depends on the type of non-market housing. So community social housing, where it's rent geared to income, typically 30% or less than income, those are not vacant. There's 3, 4, 5-year wait lists depending. I have heard reports from one housing provider that offers near market housing. I believe it's 5% below market. Those are vacant because people cannot afford them. But that is a good question and something that we could pull together and share on our website. But that's also part of like where some of this informational gaps exist. It would be great to just have a quick point in time source of information for this. So thank you for that. Another question is, are you looking for participants with lived experience only living in Edmonton? Will you be extending the invitation to individuals living in other areas in Canada, Alberta, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, we initially planned to restrict our approach to Edmonton, but I mean, working the way we are online and virtually, it provides access to this process to many others who are perhaps outside of Edmonton. So I think some of the experiences of housing insecurity and discrimination, are not place specific. They're probably shared in other cities in Edmonton and other places in Canada, and so the very essence of those experiences are very much the same and shared. And so on that basis, there is an argument to involve others who perhaps aren't in Edmonton but might want to contribute to the direction that this work is going. And so I think we would certainly explore that. We have a sort of limit regarding how many people we can involve because of the resources we have, and just the practicality of facilitating some of these exercises online. So, realistically, we can probably involve at most, I want to say 45 people in these activities. And we want at least 50% of those, that group to be ideally people from the community. So, if we can't, if we're having trouble involving community members from Edmonton, or at least reaching that threshold of 50%, I think it definitely makes a lot of sense to involve others outside of Edmonton. I don't know, Laura, what do you think?
think that's a great question. We had a presentation a couple of weeks ago, which I will be posting shortly on our YouTube channel with the National Right to Housing Network, as well as Sarah. And while traditionally based in Ontario, Sarah is expanding nationally, and the National Right to Housing Network just released a few reports today on how municipalities can implement the Canada's National Housing Strategy Act. So I think just being mindful of our own, not an excuse, but our own limited capacity and not wanting to overpromise and underdeliver. I think there's such value in connecting stories across cities and provinces and jurisdictions, because we know that there are similar trends, but also it plays out quite differently locally. We have different barriers and restrictions and circumstances in Edmonton than Halifax or Toronto or Vancouver or Winnipeg or Prince Albert. So I think if there is an interest, that's something we could definitely think about. And we were planning on reconnecting with those two organizations anyway. This might give us more of an impetus to do that and more of a clearer way forward. I think for the purpose of this, it is focused on Edmonton. We're not going to say no to participation, but like Josh said, I think the priority will be for folks in Edmonton, but we're always open. We're always willing to adjust, but I think maybe connecting with some national networks might be more useful and might kind of push some of these things forward in a much more productive way. But again, we're open to feedback. We're open to your thoughts. So please contact houselab@ualberta.ca or Josh and myself. We've got a couple more questions. If we have time, I think like we did say, we would be available till 1. If we don't have to stay till 1, we don't want to keep people, but it's great that these questions are rolling because this is helpful, really helpful for us. There was a question about in Calgary, we have too many non-market housing units that have fallen into disrepair and have been removed from the inventory. Is that also the case in Edmonton?
Great question. I'm not sure I could answer that directly. And I don't know, Laura, have you received any information along those lines?
I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the short answer is yes. Some of this housing has been redeveloped. Some of it has not. Some of our non-market housing was sold a couple of years back when the federal government changed some of their legislation around funding agreements. So yeah, we have lost inventory. And in terms of like just affordable housing, we're losing a lot of affordable housing to REITs, real estate investment trusts in the private market, who buy, quote, undervalued resources, assets, apartment buildings, usually in walkable areas, usually in spots close to transit, and then do a quick reno job and then upsell. So we are losing on-market and affordable private housing as well. I don't have those numbers up at the top of my head, but that's something we could also share. Another question, considering this is a rights-based and community-based approach, do you have any indication that the various levels of government have interest or investment to respond to these pan-Canadian efforts at research and collaboration? I can kind of answer this question unless you want to go, Josh?
I mean, that's a pretty big question.
It is.
And, like I mentioned, people here in Edmonton and in the city of Edmonton, supported and signed the call to action that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, which is, one indication of a commitment to it. What kinds of resources follow that and investments? I mean, it's hard to accurately capture that in a response here, but the National Housing Strategy, which is the federal government's main policy when it comes to housing, has been ongoing now for 5+ years, I believe. And there's been some really interesting analysis on the impact of that strategy and that policy, and it was initiated and came to have a renewed emphasis on the right to adequate housing. And so I think to answer your question, it's hard to provide a concise answer to a big question like that. But I think as a researcher like myself, the onus is really to hold governments to account in terms of what they promise and what they deliver. And that's where research can play a role. When it comes to Canada's commitment to the right to adequate housing, I think it at least provides us a framework for evaluating our progress and the government's role in making that progress. I don't know, Laura, if you'd like to give your take.
Sure, yeah, I think like almost I see two questions in here. We do have folks from the government of Canada and CMHC that are interested in participating and being a part of this initiative. We also have folks from the provincial government in the Ministry of Housing, Seniors and Housing, and we also have enthusiastic support from the City of Edmonton. So we are building that capacity. There's more we can do, but we do kind of have some of those commitments in place. And with pan-Canadian efforts at research and collaboration, I think part of the approach with the pivot is that we're not working within any sort of hierarchy, with any sort of restrictions or specific agendas in front of us, aside from what our own mission and goals are, which are on our website. So we have a freedom and a flexibility to look at things in a different way. I think sometimes that can be challenging, and I'm not saying I'm not pointing fingers at anybody, but I think change is always hard, especially within our hierarchy. But I think there are also people that are really interested in doing things in a different way, even if they're not necessarily able right now to do that within their own initiatives. So I would say yes, but there's more we can do, and the National Right to Housing Network would be a better place to ask these questions too. We have a comment. In Calgary and all across this province, we need more affordable, accessible housing, especially for those with disabilities. And we could not agree more, especially if we look at the 2006 and 2016 censuses. In Edmonton in 2006, approximately a third of households had at least one member with an activity limitation, and that increased to over 50% in 2016. So we couldn't agree more. If there's anything you would like to add, Josh.
Yeah, and only thing I would add is that, our housing system, when I was saying at the very outset of the presentation that our housing system is broken, and one of the ways it's broken is it's very ableist. It's very much built around able-bodiedness, and I think we see that reflected in some of these statistics and experiences related to the exclusion of people with, in some cases, physical impairments and other kinds of impairments from adequate housing, which is a growing problem in Alberta and in Canada more generally.
Thanks, Josh. We have another comment that the City of Edmonton had identified how many affordable units were necessary in their strategy, I think around 24,000. I think some of those projections need to be a bit disaggregated, which is the hope of some of the work of the lab in terms of what does that mean, units for who, at what level, and that's always fluctuating, so that's a challenge in and of itself. I think also some of the projections were based on census data, and some of them were based on 2011 census data, some on 2016. And there was some work done by the Capital Region, I forget the name of it, but it's a group of about 12 communities in and around Edmonton. And they did a lot of forecasting based on the 2011 census, which most of us know is not a good way of looking and understanding housing needs, especially for those that are in housing need, because that was a very underrepresented population. So I think 24,000 is a great place to start, but I think the need is much more. And with the conversations we're having, that's become really apparent. So we're hoping to maybe contextualize some of those numbers or maybe expand them a little bit more. But yeah, I think there's some stuff there. And Poverty Edmonton also has some numbers on that. We have a question about, do we have any plans to incorporate real estate developers to this process? We have a couple of questions, so I'll start with that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're an important stakeholder group in in that what we're calling the housing system, and play a really significant role when it comes to housing affordability in Edmonton, even with respect to providing low-cost housing, rental housing. So I think, the participation to this process shouldn't exclude those kinds of housing providers. Real estate developers is a general term there. It could encompass many different types of individuals and groups and organizations, including for-profit, but also perhaps even nonprofit. So yeah, I think definitely those perspectives are important to include in this process. And we have some nonprofit housing developers who've been participated in our activities, and including one of our fellows represents a nonprofit housing developer, and so those kinds of views, perspectives would also be important to include in this kind of process.
And to add to that, we have reached out to a few in the private market. We haven't received any response so far because kind of the two requirements of participating in this process is to take on a right to housing approach, as well as the nature of community-based action research. So not really sure why we haven't heard back, but that's something we're going to continue to persist with, because the more folks we have involved, the better. Another question or reflection: how do you get ideas of increasing housing supply in the market? I think I'll just maybe put my 2 cents in. It's a needs and demands question, and increasing housing supply historically has never resolved our housing challenges. In fact, that often does increase cost in Edmonton. Like, we look at our infill policies, and that's created a lot of struggle for a lot of folks in different neighborhoods. So I think increasing the certain kind of housing supply with regulation in place is really important, with a clear goal in mind, and then also adjusting for unforeseen implications from policies to encourage more housing supply. Do you want to jump in, Josh?
Yeah, when it comes to housing affordability, the supply demand, that's one way of framing the problem, certainly. And from one market to the next, sometimes supply can be a significant factor, and especially in markets where there's high demand, and it's from there we assume that it drives up the price of housing that exists. There's many other ways of framing housing affordability, and which provide us with a more precise understanding of what's really driving affordability challenges. And so, but in many Canadian markets where housing is unaffordable, there's a lot of supply, and there's a lot of vacant housing. And so in Edmonton in particular, I'm not sure. Supply is certainly an issue in some segments of the market, and looking forward in terms of forecasts, these are sort of the considerations that people make. Yeah, I'm not sure if it's necessarily a supply problem in Edmonton when it comes to housing affordability, generally speaking, of the whole population of the whole city.
That's a good point. I should have prefaced housing supply in Edmonton. It's different in other places in the world. Yeah, but we had, like, if we look at apartment vacancies, it was really high last year, about 7%, and the cost of renting really did not decrease. And we've always had a supply of houses available for homeownership. I think the challenge is also to identify who is purchasing homes and for what reason, because it's not households or families that are competing with one another or are seeking housing. We also have to factor in things like beneficial ownership and real estate investment trusts, groups that are buying up housing for different reasons, for privatization and financialization. So it's a big picture, and there's a lot going on. And this would be a great topic in and of itself for a series on its own. So we thank you for your question. And then there was like a three-part question. So the third part is, do you consider other tools available to address affordability as incentives, releasing government lands to market, or low interest bank loans, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole suite of approaches. There's a number of levers that municipalities have at their disposal to encourage the development of affordable housing. And we have a nice blog on our website, actually, which lists many of those levers that municipalities can use to encourage. And one of those is land banking, for example, like providing land to developers who are building non-market housing or affordable housing. And so, yeah, like there's a number of different approaches, and often, you know, there's not one of them on their own is sufficient enough to solve some of these challenges, but it's more likely that a comprehensive approach, a combination of many of these types of approaches is necessary. And that includes things like rent controls and regulation, right? I mean, that's a really important mechanism that it can be very powerful in maintaining a supply of affordable housing.
Thank you. And just to add to that, typically releasing municipal lands to private developers in the private market just kind of adds to the problem in the long term. When you say do we consider other tools? As a lab, we're thinking and exploring all options. The municipal levers is a good resource on our blog, which I'll post quickly after this. But I think we need to look at housing that's not under a financialized model over time. There's some really interesting things happening in France, where the city has taken things into their own hands and are doing things in a different kind of way. I don't think we have any other questions.
Well, those were great questions. I feel like many of you might have had some better answers and responses that I could have provided. So this is one of the limitations of this particular format, which was designed more of an information session. And I'm really looking forward to the upcoming orientation and virtual gathering, which will provide all of you with more opportunity to actually tell us the answer to some of these questions that have been posted here. So I popped my email in the chat. So if you do have questions or follow-up that you want to provide to me directly and to Laura as well, you can certainly contact me directly with that email, and I'll respond as quickly as I can. So not having any more questions, and it's almost 1 o'clock, almost the end of the lunch hour here, so I don't want to keep you longer. I really want to thank all of you who participated, and even those who have had to leave. I see our participants have dropped off a little bit. I want to thank you for your participation, those great questions, any feedback that's forthcoming. As well, I want to acknowledge those who might be watching this recording as well. And you're more than welcome to reach out to me after watching this video, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have. So I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I hope to see you and meet some of you later. Bye, everyone.